So welcome. My name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator at the Nantucket Atheneum, which is the public library on the island of Nantucket. I'm joined by Janet Forrest, my colleague, who just popped out, but she's here. And I'm so appreciative that you took the time to come see us tonight and join us for this great program. As we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type your questions in there, and we'll let them pile up. And when we get to the end of the presentation, Ted will take questions. So I think that's it for me. I'm going to say a couple of words about Ted, and then we'll be off and running. So you might recognize Ted Reinstein from the Channel 5 program Chronicle, where he has been a reporter since 1995. He's also the author of 3 books. His first book is New England Notebook, One Reporter, 6 States, Uncommon Stories. Then his second book is, I love this title, Wicked Pissed, New England's Most Famous Feuds. And finally, his third book is New England's General Stores, Exploring an American Classic. So without further ado, please take it away, Ted.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Janet. It is, it's funny, folks, we were just talking, the 3 of us, a few moments ago about, it's been such a horrible year, and public libraries, which are a passion of mine, obviously are trying to continue, despite all the challenges, one of the things they do best, which is programming like this one. And, the Atheneum in Nantucket is a library that I have never had the opportunity to speak at. I have walked by it many times on visits to the island, but this is a way that I am able to do it in the middle of a week. Be able to speak to you folks in Nantucket, which is great. We all wish that it were in person, and I hope it will be again very soon. So thank you all for coming out and joining me tonight, coming to the library, as it were. I'm going to talk to you tonight about a talk that I developed over the summer. I developed 2 talks just for the purpose of helping to create some content for public libraries during this period where they're trying to reopen virtually and reconnect with their patrons and continue programming virtually, because obviously not able yet to do that in person. So I developed a couple of talks using my interest in a number of my stories over the years of reporting all around New England for the past 22, 23 years. And tonight I'm going to share with you one of those 2 talks, Fighting Back, New England's Underdogs. When I thought about preparing this talk and creating it over the summer, I thought about the stories, some of the stories that I felt most passionate about, and some of the stories that involve people, places that I had developed a continuing, enduring relationship with. In other words, not just from doing a story at one time, but these are in large part people and places that I have continued a relationship with, in some cases for almost 20 years. And the reason why these stories have stood out to me, the reason why some of these people are people that I have wanted to stay in touch with, is that they are people who have fought back. They are people who have fought back in their personal lives. They are towns that have fought back to save something. Underdogs have always appealed to me as a journalist, because it's a story that tells 2 wonderful things, right? Underdog stories not only tell about a person who is fighting back. Sometimes it's a person who is fighting back to overcome some terrible odds, overcome some terrible adversity. It could be physical, it could be emotional, right? And sometimes just to fight back, and the success is being able to lead a life of dignity and purpose and meaning, right? And sometimes, as you'll see tonight, sometimes these are people who have fought back from crushing odds and achieved amazing things. So there's that level, right? There's that level that we love about an underdog story because it's inspiring. But I also love about underdog stories is that it inspires us as a people. It inspires us as just members of humanity, right? Because if somebody can fight back, if somebody is able to overcome something, then we all can do that. We can do it as individuals. We can do it as families. We can do it as communities. We can do it as a nation. That's what's always appealed to me. That's what I'm going to share with you tonight. Some of those stories that have really stayed with me, as you'll see, in some cases for many years. So fighting back, how does the dictionary describe underdogs, right? So, a loser or predicted loser in a struggle who, as we know, does not always accept that, but, or a victim of injustice or persecution. All the people that I'm going to share with you tonight, and in some cases, they're institutions, a couple of those as well, are people who have done that. They're people who have been underdogs and who have fought back. People like, just as examples to start out, right? Little overture of people here. Louis Escobar. Louis Escobar is a farmer still today in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, Quidnick Island, another island in New England. And Louis had a devastating accident on his farm, small dairy farm, produces a lot of milk. Most of it sold in Rhode Island. And about 10, 12 years ago, the tractor that Louis was riding on fell on him, crushed his vertebrae, left him in a wheelchair. He did not give up the fact that he wanted to be in day-to-day charge of running his dairy farm, and he still is. That's his summer wheelchair. Believe it or not, this guy has a wheelchair with wheels that are like those big fat tires on bikes, right? And he just is not stoppable. He's not stoppable. So in some ways, Louis Escobar is like the ultimate underdog in terms of fighting back. Tanja Milovic grew up in war-torn Serbia during the Bosnian Civil War. And in the late 80s, early 90s, her family came over here. They escaped the fighting in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And she had macular degeneration. And by the time she was just a little older than she is here, I believe here she is in 3rd grade. So by the time she was 9 or 10 years old, 11 for certain, she was completely blind, had lost her vision. And she did not lose her sense of pluck and of wanting to do what she wants to do. This young woman, who today is in her mid-20s, graduated with honors in library science from Simmons College, went on to get a graduate degree. She has a full-time job today in Watertown, Massachusetts at the Perkins School of the Blind. She commutes for about an hour and a quarter every day from her home in Everett. And with her trusty service dog, Naboo, she navigates a commute, morning and evening commute, that involves 2 MBTA buses, 2 different train lines, the orange and the red. And she's traveled around the world with Naboo by herself. So you talk about fighting back. A more recent example of a wonderful underdog and a wonderful fighting back story, Manuel Coronado. Manuel grew up in Panama. He graduated from high school 2 years ago with highest honors in Panama. Some difficulties there, some family difficulties. It was felt that it would be better if he changed his scenery, and nothing that he had done, but it was difficult for the family. And he moved up to Boston to be with his grandmother, his elderly grandmother, who is now 88. She lives in Jamaica Plain in Boston. And Manuel Coronado came up here. He wanted to go to college, to be the first in his family to go to college, but quickly found out that he was going to need to repeat high school. Even though he had graduated with honors, that was the rules that he was facing. So he started out early last year, finishing up high school at Brighton High School in Boston, became the captain of the debate team, and then the coronavirus hit, and school was suspended. He needed to get a job. He got a job working in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, Newton, where he was working at an elderly care facility and started working full-time and became the sole breadwinner at 19 years old. Sole breadwinner for himself and his grandmother. He took great pains to make sure that he was taking care not to bring any germs back in the house. Devised this whole system, you know, of plastic sheeting in the closet where he'd come in and before he would come out, and just an amazing young guy. And now he is finishing up. He will undoubtedly go to school. He's been accepted already a couple of places, and he will become the first in his family to go to college. So the first sort of extended profile in Fighting Back I want to share with you, one of my favorite New Englanders I've ever met, Winston Morel. Winston, or Win Morel, as his friends referred to him, was a whole chapter from my first book. I love things that are small. And I guess that goes also to my love of underdogs, because sometimes underdogs are small. Many things that are small, you know, the smallest this or the smallest that, have a harder time sometimes. They have a harder time, you know, achieving the same success that maybe bigger things do, maybe bigger things that have more money or more standing or physically, what have you. But he was in a chapter, an entire chapter in my first book, New England Notebook, about the wonderful world of small. And the reason why, and the chapter was called the Wonderful Miniature World of Winston Morel, is because Winston Morel made a career, even though it wasn't his full-time job, of creating things that were beyond small. They were not only tiny, but they were incredible creations. So what you're looking at right there, those are 3 cigar boxes, right? So there would be, first of all, those are cigar boxes. So there would be cigars sitting in, which by themselves are not that big, right? And yet those little boxes there are full of tiny books, which is very appropriate since we're connected with a library tonight. Those are tiny, tiny books. He made thousands and thousands of tiny books. How tiny? So these books, while they don't have printed pages per se, they do have pages. They have bound covers, right, that have a binding, and they have titles. And there you see, so they're sitting on a dime, just to give you an idea. So that there, right, that's a dime, right? And that book is not taking up the entire dime. And the other book, there's a penny, is not taking up an entire penny. That's how small they are. As I said, he made actual books with actual pages, actually bound covers. He told me once that he was fascinated with books because he only went as far as the 10th grade. And I think he felt that he wanted to become a wonderful reader. He wanted to learn everything he could because he felt that somehow he had been denied that by leaving school when he did. He made his own tools to do this tiny little work. And it wasn't only tiny books. He also put thousands of mini ships in bottles, which takes incredible dexterity. He built his own home by himself for his wife and his daughter. And he also worked a full-time job as a greengrocer on the North Shore of Massachusetts. Now, I mentioned that it takes great dexterity. You can imagine it takes great dexterity to make a book the size of a bound book that will sit on the cover of a dime. And it takes great dexterity to create ships in a bottle, which Winston Morel had, but you'll be surprised that he did all that and achieved all that with only one working arm. He only had one arm that was actually working. He had polio, another epidemic, right? So the polio epidemic in the 40s cost him the use of his right arm. So he had only one arm. And at the point that I met when he had the use of only one eye, he had degeneration himself in one eye. So he had the use of only one arm and one eye. And yet he created all these tiny things that require incredible dexterity. To watch him work on these things was just awe-inspiring in the truest sense. He never pitied himself. he spoke more about other people he knew that had suffered from polio. He'd say, hey, at least I was able to walk. He said President Roosevelt couldn't walk. He said, but I could walk. And he would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. He was up every day by 3 a.m. He said there was so much to do. And one of my prized possessions, I'll share with you right here, you're looking at right there, is this. So this is a ship in a bottle that Winston Morel created for me. You can't see it, but with it, so it's got a big ship. There's two little boats, little sailboats in the foreground, and each one of those is named for each of my two daughters, and all kinds of little books with covers and titles that he thought would appeal to me. And it is one of my absolute prized possessions from Winston Morel. We lost Winston Morel 2 years ago. He died in 2018. The first time I met Win, when I left after being absolutely just in awe for about 2.5 hours watching him work. And I asked him, I said, nobody really sees what you do. I know that you never sold anything. You give all these things away. And I said, but so few people see what you're working on. Does it ever bother you? And why do you do it? What is it that drives you to do it? And he said, I guess maybe with my handicap, I was always trying to prove that I could be as good as anybody else. And I think that he answered that statement with his life. So I mentioned that sometimes it's not a person, right, that is fighting back. Sometimes it's something else. And in this case, it's an entire city. It's an entire city. Gloucester, on Cape Ann, another maritime place in New England, like Nantucket, with a storied maritime history. It is in some ways, I would say, along with Nantucket and New Bedford, Gloucester is one of the 3 probably most storied seaports in America's history. To some extent, New Orleans, and I guess New York too. But we're in Massachusetts, so naturally we sing the praises of our own maritime history. The thing about Gloucester is that, unlike Nantucket, it never regained the prosperity it once had as a fishing port. New Bedford held on to that. It lost other things, but it held on to that. Nantucket developed this wonderful, community, and there's tourism, and it has attracted affluence, fishing long after its heyday as a whaling port left. But once Gloucester really lost the heyday of its fishing industry, and once the fishing regs really kicked in over the last 30 years, Gloucester became a tough place. Tough place. A lot of fishermen lost their livelihood. Terrible problems with drugs, unemployment. So Gloucester, however, has never stopped being a place that has fought back. There used to be, you're looking at an old postcard there of Gloucester Harbor. I had someone tell me once he was the grandson of fishing captains in Gloucester. He said, my grandfather told me that there was a time in the teens, in the 1920s, 1930s, when he said there were so many ships in the horseshoe that makes up Gloucester's inner harbor that he said it was said that you could walk all around the harbor without stepping on land or stepping on a dock or landing in the water, that you could just walk from stern to bow or bow to stern and stern to bow all the way around the horseshoe of the harbor. That's how many boats were at one time, fishing boats at one time in Gloucester's inner harbor. Obviously, times change. Times change everywhere, but we know that the fishing regulations, as necessary as they may be, but have had the effect of pushing many, many fishermen out of business. Today, if you walk around Gloucester's inner harbor, it's a ghost of itself. It's a ghost of itself. There are some full-time fishing boats less. There are now less than 12. less than 12 full-time fishing boats in Gloucester Harbor. You'll see a lot of buildings just like that falling into the water. So obviously it's changed. I remember spending a day with a day fisherman. So this is the Alex and Alexa, Aaron and Alexa, I'm sorry, Doug Swicker. But day fishermen really have it rough because there aren't many left. The regs have really changed that because a guy like Doug may plan on going out to fish, let's say, on a day for halibut or haddock. And he may have decided, I'm going to head out to Stellwagen Bank. He may wake up that day and find out that there's been a rolling closure and Stellwagen's closed. And now he's got on the fly to decide what else he's going to do. And that's pretty tough. It drove Doug out of business. It's driven most day fishermen, a lot of day fishermen out of business. And I always point out, it isn't just the ground fishermen, it's not just the ground fishery. The shell fishery is also suffering. People like Gussie Contrino, lobstering out there off of Rockport. So it's all of these folks who have made up on Cape Ann a history of Gloucester where fishermen have been the ultimate underdogs. But the wonderful thing that I love to point out about Cape Ann, about Gloucester and its companion Rockport, is that the fishermen have always had this wonderful companion in arms, or companion in misery, when it comes to being underdogs, artists, right? There's a wonderful, equally storied, long-time tradition of artists on Cape Ann, especially Rocky Neck, certainly Rockport, and Rocky Neck on Gloucester, where artists themselves have this long history. There's just this long tradition of underdogs and artists and fishermen, these underdogs in arms. Emile Group, painter of Pirates Lane, one of the leading painters of this tradition of artists on Cape Ann. And some of these artists, as you may know, are world famous. And these three right here spent considerable time and some of their most formative years as painters, as artists, in Gloucester. Edward Hopper, Winslow Homer, Fitzhenry Lane. These are world famous artists. And all three of those paintings right there represent scenes in Gloucester. People have come and resettled in Gloucester. Gordon and Judith Getterman, a wonderful example of these people who've been drawn to the artist community, the artist tradition in Gloucester, in Rocky Neck. Gordon and Judith, sadly, both gone now, but they opened up the Getterman Gallery. And today, they established an endowment for a scholarship for younger artists, still today on Cape Ann. And it's not just, it's across many mediums, right? Across many mediums. My longtime friend, Mark Kanakis, is a wonderful landscape photographer in Rockport, grew up in Rockport, had a gallery for many years on Bearskin Neck in Rockport Harbor. Wonderful photographer. Twin Lights, Thatcher Island. Was just up there the last 2 days working on a story. His photographs, some wonderful photographs. There's Rockport Harbor, motif number 1 at sunset. Now, I want to draw your attention to his painting of the inner harbor. You see the trawler. Follow the mast of the trawler, right? Follow the mast of the trawler up straight. And at the very top of that hill, you see this wonderful spire. It's actually twin spires. It's kind of a yellow steeple and a blue cap on the steeple. That's the Portuguese Church, which is very famous, built by Portuguese fishermen in the 19th century. So follow the mast up. So there you see Mark Kanakis, who's a contemporary artist on Cape Ann. That's his photograph, right? What do you see in Edward Hopper's photograph of the Portuguese Church in Gloucester, the spires of the Portuguese Church? So some of these subjects in Gloucester have attracted artists for hundreds of years. World famous artists today, like Mark Kanakis. I love that. I asked Mark in closing out. I asked Mark once, I said, do you think you ever are envious of each other? The artists of the fishermen of the artists. And he said, look, I think that there are gray, chilly days in the middle of the winter when guys are out working on their boats or lobstermen are hauling up traps and they look in and they see the lights in the galleries in Rocky Neck and they think, the little curls of smoke coming up from our wood stoves. And he said, I'm sure they would love to be inside the warm gallery. But he said, I'll tell you what, he said, hot summer day, gorgeous day out on the water. He said, I would give anything to be working on a boat on those days. So they have been sort of intertwined in their history of being underdogs for hundreds of years, the fishermen and the artists on Cape Ann. This is an example of an underdog. I'm constantly looking for underdogs. I'm constantly looking for these wonderful stories of people fighting back and overcoming odds. This was a story that I just found out about just this past fall. So just less than 6 months ago. Harriet E. Wilson grew up in Milford, New Hampshire, in the sort of early 1800s, 1830, I think she was born, 1832, 1825, I'm sorry. And what makes her amazing as a person, as a woman, is that she was literally left on the doorstep of a white family of some means by her family. She was biracial. Her young parents were not able to support their children. And she literally was left on a doorstep and became an indentured servant to this family. And at the same time, became a voracious reader. She became an incredibly world-aware, informed woman, writer, kept a journal. And in 1859, Harriet E. Wilson became the first African-American woman in North America to have a novel published. And another amazing woman, this is the Harriet E. Wilson Memorial. And the reason the Harriet E. Wilson Memorial exists today, it was dedicated in 2006 in a park in Milford, New Hampshire, is another wonderful underdog, Jerry Ann Bogus. Jerry Ann was an immigrant from Jamaica, immigrated to America, moved to Milford, New Hampshire, delved into history of Harriet E. Wilson, and not only was behind the creation of the Harriet E. Wilson Memorial, but Jerry Ann is also one of the founders of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And today introduces people, visitors to New Hampshire, about some of the unlikely Black history in the Granite State. So I love the pairing of those two women and what they've accomplished. Very, very great story. If you're ever in Milford, it's a really inspiring monument, and it's in a wonderful park. So now I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of the short time we have on, well, there's no other way to put it. This is the story of the most inspiring woman I have ever met in my life. My older sister, my mom, my grandmother, all inspiring women. This woman really inspires me more than anybody I've ever met. In some ways, man or woman. An incredible underdog. And she won. She came from, as you will hear in a moment, absolutely crushing odds. But Lynn Donahue succeeded in a way that is really hard to believe. So we're talking about another storied fishing port. I mentioned New Bedford in passing. Now we're in New Bedford for real. And New Bedford, of course, once was considered the city that lit the world, because New Bedford, along with Nantucket, the two most storied whaling capitals of America. In the 17 and early 1800s, the whale oil that was brought back to New Bedford and Nantucket truly did light the world. Unlike Gloucester, New Bedford, for a variety of reasons I'm not going to go into, has managed to hold on to its fishing prosperity. The last 4 years in a row, I'm not sure about 2020, but certainly up to 2019, for several years, New Bedford led America in landings, fish land. So was still the most prosperous fishing port in America. But the mills that had sort of created the newer prosperity after the whaling industry left New Bedford in the 19th century. Once the mills left, although the fishing industry survived, the fishing industry doesn't now and never has sort of translated into prosperity for the city as a whole. It's been good for the fishermen, the owners of the boats and related industries. It has never carried over into broader prosperity for the city. And when the mills had shut down, there was a long slide ahead for New Bedford. And by the 1970s, downtown New Bedford was a really bad place. The city was really, really a bad place. There was double-digit unemployment, crime, drugs, building after building shuttered and darkened in downtown New Bedford. It was a tough, crushing place to be, a place that didn't feel like it had much of a future. And that was the place that Lynn Donahue was born and came of age. And I first met Lynn about 16 years ago. And I walked around downtown New Bedford with Lynn, and I'll never forget, she pointed out casually as we're walking along, and she would point out that building, that building right there, and that bar is where so-and-so worked. And she was pointing out places, either homes, apartments, places where somebody had worked, all the places that went with people, friends, classmates that she had lost, that were dead, all of them to overdoses, drugs. And she ticked off at least half a dozen places, people that she had known. And she was quick to point out that that's where she was headed. She said, I absolutely might have ended up dead. I was going nowhere good. She was the product of a terribly dysfunctional family, 6 kids, alcoholic, physically abusive father. Mother worked 2 or 3 jobs trying to support the family. Father ran a bar. Not very little influence in her life, certainly not positive influence. And she quit school when she was 16, moved out of the house at 16 and a half. And as I said, by her own admission, was going the way of some of these kids who later died. And she said, I probably would have had it not been for what saved me. And I'm going to share with you what saved her now. But this is an amazing. It's interesting when you look at people who reach a point in their life where they are falling, right? They're falling. Sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's love, sometimes it's or the lack of thereof, or losing a job, what have you, right? And it's interesting, what are the factors that sometimes save somebody? It ranges from love. For some people, it's religion. For some people, it may be art. It may be an inspiring person that helps, what have you. For Lynn Donahue, it was the most unlikely thing, which to a lot of younger people today, they wouldn't even relate to. But of those of us of a certain age will certainly be familiar with good old-fashioned newspaper advertisements, right? Because that's what saved Lynn Donahue. She saw an advertisement for a training program. So this is the period of the early to mid 1970s, and it is the period of Title IX, right? So we think of Title IX, we often think of it in connection with scholastic sports, right? And the federal government, long overdue, trying to level the playing field for real, right? Literally, to make it possible for scholastic sports to be more equal and welcoming to young women. And what we don't often think of, though, is that other parts of the government, other departments, were also using Title IX as a way to level the playing field in various facets of American life. And the Labor Department was using Title IX to create more equality, more equity in labor where women were underrepresented. And one place in labor that women were almost completely underrepresented at that point in time was the construction trades. And so the Department of Labor were running several training programs where they were offering free training programs for women who were interested in learning a building trade. And Lynn Donahue saw an ad for a training program to become a mason, a bricklayer. And she decided to go for it. And it was being run at a local, I believe, the University of Southeastern Massachusetts in Dartmouth, 3 nights a week. She went to work on her dad's bar to be able to afford gas money to drive a beat up old car, the half hour, 3 nights a week. Lynn was one of 7 women who started the program. She was the only woman to finish and receive her certificate as a certified bricklayer. And you know, I asked her when we met, I said, what was it that appealed to you about becoming a bricklayer? I mean, she had said that there was no history of that in her family. There was no one in her family had been in the construction trades at all, never mind being a bricklayer. And I said, what was it that appealed to you? What was it that something struck you? She said, you know, I thought about it over the years, and she said, I think it's very simple, really. She said, you know, everything about my life up to that point was all about, as she put it, shit falling apart. Everything was falling apart in my life. My family, my friends, everything was falling apart. Nothing seemed to be anything I could hold on to. Nothing seemed to represent something that was stable, that I could count on, that would be safe for me and strong. And she said, the idea of like putting together a building, a brick, what's stronger than a brick, right? That would last and be strong. She said, I just really fell in love with that idea. And she became a bricklayer. She became a bricklayer. She got her certificate. She graduated this training program, the only woman. And the same day that she finished the program and got her signed certificate, she returned to New Bedford and she went to the local union office, 139 American Bricklayers Union. And she presented her certificate and said, I am here. I am qualified to lay brick and I would like to be sent out for work. And she said, this guy looked at me like a zebra had just walked into the building. And he looked at her up and down and he said, let me tell you something. He said, you're not tall enough, you're not strong enough, and you're a woman. Only he didn't use the word woman. And figured that she'd get the message, and he went back to work and ignored her. That was about 10 o'clock in the morning. At 2 o'clock, she was still there. At 3 o'clock, she was still there. At 5 o'clock, when he was ready to leave for the day, he said, listen, I don't know what you're doing here, but I'm going home, and so are you. And she said, well, I'll go home, but I'll be back here tomorrow morning, and I'm going to sit here until I'm sent out for work because I'm qualified to work, and I want to be able to work. And he said, he grabbed a note from his desk, a little notepad. He scrawled an address for a project that was currently being built in next door in Fall River. It was a 3-story parking garage. And he gave her the note and he said, honey, it's your funeral, which was almost eerily prophetic. And she showed up. She showed up the next morning on this building site. And she presented her certificate. She presented the note. And she said to the foreman, I'm here to go to work, to lay brick. And he laughed and he said, are you kidding me? Only he added a colorful little adjective between the R and the kidding. And she said, no, I'm not kidding. I'm here for work. I've been told I can work and I'm good at it and I want to work. And when she continued to stay there for an hour, this guy too realized I'm not getting rid of this woman. So he said, fine, that scaffolding over there, go up to the second level. I'll see what you can do. And she did. And he watched her for a while. And after a couple of hours, he went up there and he took a closer look over his shoulder. And he said grudgingly, That's not bad. And he went back down and he muttered over his shoulder, "You can show up tomorrow if you want." That was a big success in Lynn's mind. Mind you, this accounted for the single only note of any sort of welcome, because to the other guys who were working on the job, she was made to feel most unwelcome. Nobody talked to her. Nobody asked her, "Hey, you want to come over and sit while we have lunch?" In fact, she opened her lunch pail the second day she was there, and there was a dead pigeon sitting on her sandwich. They made a point of telling awful, dirty jokes, in raised voices so that she could hear. And that she went out the week that way. She showed up the following week to continue working and went to the same ladder and to go up the scaffolding. And as she reached the top of the scaffolding to step onto it, it gave way. It didn't give way because it was an accident. It gave way because the scaffolding had been unsecured from the ladder. So it was deliberate. And Lynn Donahue fell 14 feet. She broke a rib. She broke an elbow. She severely sprained both ankles, severely sprained a wrist, suffered contusions on her face, was taken to the hospital, was seen. Not a lot you can do about a rib. It's very, very painful. But a couple of stitches, she was bandaged up, and the doctors told her, "You need to be off your feet for 6 weeks." 1 week later, Lynn Donahue was back at the construction site. And I talked to one huge guy, speaking of Portuguese, big Portuguese mason from the South Shore, from Somerset, Mass. And he worked on that job. And he said, "You know what?" He said, "We watched her drive up. We watched her get out of her car. We thought, you gotta be kidding me." And we watched her, he said, it looked like a penguin. She was sort of like waddling her way to the ladder. And he said, somehow got her way up the ladder. He said she had a damn trowel, metal with a big wooden handle, literally clenched in her mouth so she could carry up her other tools, and got up there and wriggled off the ladder and onto the scaffolding and went back to work. And as he put it, there were no more jokes about Lynn Donahue. He said, instead, we were like, this woman's like a fighter. And they started to talk to her. They started to eat their lunch with her. They started to realize that this woman was not only a fabulous mason, a fabulous bricklayer, but she was smart. She like was smart. She had a great business. They started bringing questions about their paychecks and about deductions and about whether they should invest in a stock somebody had told them about. And she knew all this stuff. And about a year later, the same company got a bid, successfully bid on the relaying of the cobblestones in New Bedford's historic whaling district, and they needed 6 people. And Lynn Donahue was one of the 6 people that this company picked to relay the cobblestones and today you can see her work, which still exists today in New Bedford. And a year after that, the federal government reached back out to Lynn Donahue directly, because this time, the Department of Labor was also using Title IX to try to level the playing field when it came now not just to the building trades themselves, but one facet of the building trade that was not just underrepresented by women, but unrepresented by women, which was women who own their own contracting businesses. So women who would now run a construction company, there were none. And Lynn Donahue was one of about a dozen women around the country who were personally selected by the Labor Department to get these low interest and in some cases no interest loans to learn and start their own construction companies. And she did. She started Argus Construction in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And this is where the Lynn Donahue story, if you look at it like this arc from unlikely to incredible, this is where the Lynn Donahue story, I always say, takes a turn to grace. Because Lynn Donahue, now as a person who owned her own construction company, she had to hire employees in southeastern Massachusetts. And because of her fabulous business sense, she was like the bid whisperer, right? There's an art to bidding. And she just seemed to have this sixth sense about bidding on construction projects. And she was attracting all these jobs. She was winning all these bids. And she needed a lot of people to work for her. She was now in a position of hiring some of the very people who had once not only made her work life miserable initially, but in some cases, perhaps some of the very people who may have tried to kill her. And now some of these same people were approaching her for work. And you know what she said to every single one of these people? This is a woman who had every reason to take vengeance on some of these awful people. But instead, what she said to every single person who was qualified and asked her for a job, she said 2 words: "You're hired." And that gentleman who I spoke about a moment ago, who worked on that job in Fall River, that very first job that Lynn Donahue worked on, where she almost died, he went to work for her for many years. And as he put it, he said, "Let me tell you something." He said, across southeastern Massachusetts today, there is an army of guys like me who would walk through a wall for Lynn Donahue, because she became the best boss most of these men ever had. She knew everybody's name. She insisted on personally handing out a paycheck every week and shaking everybody's hand to whom she gave a paycheck. She knew their names. She knew their wives' names. She knew when their birthdays were. She knew their kids' names. She knew when their kids' birthdays were. And it floored some of these guys. That guy I was talking about, he said, there were jobs I worked on for 2.5, 3 years. He said, sometimes these guys never knew my name. They didn't know my name. And he said, she became like a family friend. And he said, I owe my life to Lynn Donahue. I was sick, and she insisted and found me a doctor and got me seen by a doctor who discovered a tumor in my left lung. He said, that's Lynn Donahue. I would die for her. This was now the boss of all these guys who had made her life miserable. So because of her great business sense, Argus Construction, her company, thrived. And it became one of the most successful construction companies in southeastern Massachusetts. But she wasn't done. She wasn't done. She had never finished school, and she wanted to finish school. And in 2006, she wrote, in conjunction with a co-author, an autobiography. She titled it Brick by Brick, about her life. But Brick by Brick also became, because this was part of her idea, and she didn't want to just write a book. Part of her idea in writing the book was to establish a foundation called Brick by Brick, which still exists and thrives today. And the purpose and mission of the foundation was to help at-risk kids in New Bedford who could have used the help that Lynn Donahue could have used when she was their age. And today, the Brick by Brick Foundation continues to help at-risk teens in New Bedford. And what's wonderful about it, and I think ingeniously creative, it does it by using the same sort of construction blueprint, right, that you would on a construction job. And it asks kids to essentially create a blueprint for your future, just like you would if you were approaching a construction project, right? What's your budget? What kind of money do you think you need? What's your timeline? What's your endpoint? What are the tools that you're going to need? You're going to need an education. What kind of an education? What's going to be the budget for that? What's the timeline for that? And these kids swear by this kind of process, brick by brick, uses. So that thrives. It thrives still. But Lynn Donahue still wasn't done. She wanted to go back to school. She did. She finished college and she loved education. So she decided to go to graduate school and study women's studies because she wanted to be able to travel around and to share with women her story of fighting back, her story of finding a way that I could succeed when odds were against me. And she does that today. She does it today with a new title because Lynn Donahue today is Dr. Lynn Donahue. And she travels around the world speaking to women on how they can empower themselves and how they can empower their own lives, no matter where, no matter why they find themselves as underdogs. Most inspiring women I've ever met. So in closing, I said sometimes an underdog can be an institution, not a place and not a person. The Putney General Store. I love general stores. I wrote a whole book about it. But the Putney General Store, if you want to find out a great story about a general store as underdog, Google the Putney General Store in Putney, Vermont, because this is a general store that was saved by a community that refused to give up its beloved general store, not once, but twice, through two different fires that at one point burned it entirely to the ground. And like a phoenix, it rose back. You talk about perseverance in a place like Putney and the general store as underdog. And as I finish, it occurred to me as I was putting this talk together this past summer that I've spent the bulk of the last year writing what will be my fourth book, which will be released by Lions Press next September. And the title of the book is Before Brooklyn, the Unsung Heroes Who Helped Break Baseball's Color Barrier. And it is all about, I realize, it is all about underdogs. It is the total underdog story because as for until 1947 and Jackie Robinson and the Brooklyn Dodgers, Black baseball players were not able to play in the major leagues. There was a color barrier. One of the worst obscenities I love baseball. I played baseball all through high school, but Major League Baseball will never be able to outlive the infamy of its color barrier. But there were people who for over 60 years before Jackie Robinson were paving the way for Jackie Robinson to break the color barrier in 1947. People local to New England, people like Mabray Kountze, or otherwise known as Doc Kountze, who was a wonderful Black journalist and became the first Black journalist, first African-American journalist to receive an official press pass by the Boston Red Sox. The Boston Red Sox, as you probably know, had a lot of, making up to do when it came to, restoring any semblance of good faith with the Black community, because the Red Sox, in their own infamy, were the very last major league team to integrate baseball. Over 11 years after the Brooklyn Dodgers. And Mabray Kountze became the first African-American journalist to receive a press pass. Underdogs in this story of breaking the color barrier that most people have never heard of. People like Bud Fowler, people like Moses Fleetwood Walker, who were among the first professional Black baseball players. Moses Fleetwood Walker was the very first major league Black player. And that was in the 1870s and early 1880s. But by the late 1880s, Fowler and Walker cast out of baseball and could not play in the major leagues. And it follows all the way up through the 30s and 40s and into the 50s before the Negro Leagues finally dissolved after Jackie Robinson. But you probably have heard of Josh Gibson. You may or may not have heard of Cool Papa Bell, who many say was the fastest baseball player ever to live. You probably have heard of Satchel Paige, probably the single most famous Negro leaguer of all time. Satchel Paige did finally make it to the major leagues, although at that point he was in his late 40s. But Josh Gibson, who may have been the greatest slugger in baseball history, and Cool Papa Bell, who may have been the fastest player to ever live, never did make it to the major leagues, because when the color line was broken in the 1940s, although both of them were still playing baseball, neither of them at that point were young enough to be signed by a major league team. And you talk about the Red Sox in Fenway Park. One of the stories that I key on in the new book takes place in April 16th, 1945, when Jackie Robinson himself had a tryout. I don't know if you know that or not. Some people know. But Jackie Robinson actually had a tryout at Fenway Park by the Boston Red Sox, but it was a sham. The Red Sox never had any intention of actually, taking action on the 3 black ball players, one of whom included Jackie Robinson, and signing them to a major league contract. But the fact that the tryout was held represents this wonderful collaboration that happened between 2 underdogs themselves. Wendell Smith, who was a wonderful black journalist with the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the preeminent black newspapers of the time, and Isidore Izzy Muchnick, who became the first Jewish American chairman of the Boston School Committee. And at this time, he was only the second Jewish member of the Boston City Council. And they collaborated on an ingenious plan, which I go into at length in the book, on how they could force the Red Sox to hold a tryout for some black ball players. And they did. The Red Sox did. These players never heard from the Red Sox again. But less than 6 months later, the Brooklyn Dodgers did get in touch with Jackie Robinson, and that became the breaking of the color barrier in 1947. So that will be my book comes out in the fall before Brooklyn. And that is the story that I've shared with you tonight. That is the story of New England's underdogs, according to me anyway. And I would be happy to take questions now. I'll invite Janet and Amy back. And if any of you have had questions, if you've put them in queue in the chat, we can certainly go to them now. If you haven't, you're more than welcome to put them in chat now. And one last piece of business, if you'll permit me, 10 seconds of shameless commerce. I'm going to leave up here. These are my 3 books. And if anybody has any interest in checking out any of my books, the easiest way to go is just go to my website, tedreinstein.com, and you'll be able to do that from the website. And with that, I will turn things back over to Amy and Janet, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. I'll give you a minute to catch your breath.
Yeah. This is my favorite moment. I get to stop talking for a minute.
Well, I love seeing Cape Ann tonight because that's where I come from. So I love seeing Rockport and Gloucester.
Where in Cape Ann, Amy?
Rockport.
Rockport.
Yeah, my mom lives about 500 feet away from the motive.
Oh, so one of my favorite places in Cape Ann, Halibut Point.
Oh yeah,
I love Halibut Point. Been taking my kids there before they could walk.
Yeah, I go hiking there quite a bit. It's a state park now.
Yes, isn't it wonderful? You can lose yourself, and not to mention others down on the rocks there, right?
Yeah,
great place. Great place.
And it's got an old lookout station from World War II where they used to look for submarines. It's very spooky looking.
It is. And that quarry, which is now filled, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how I ended up at a sandbar. I like granite.
Sandbars have their appeal.
They do. They do.
Ted, I have a question for you.
Sure.
How did you go about finding your subjects?
Yeah, good question, Janet. So all of the subjects that I shared with you tonight were all stories that I have done as a reporter. So in terms of how I found them originally, that's a good question. Those of us longtime reporters at Chronicle have developed, each of us probably peculiar to ourselves, all kinds of ways that we end up finding stories and people in stories like these. Sometimes people get in touch with me, and sometimes in my travels around doing some other story, I will come upon a thread, that I follow, and that's led to something else. I'm also just an inveterate news junkie. I mean, I read, papers every day and magazines, and I'm a voracious reader. So, I just come across things. So all kinds of different ways. I can't just think offhand right now unless I really stop entirely and pause for a moment, which I won't. But I'm sure that each of those stories that I just shared tonight came about through one of those ways.
Mm-hmm. And how, I mean, I guess if they came to you, but like how receptive are people to being profiled? Like the guy with the tiny books, like he seems like a bit of an introvert.
Yeah.
And how receptive are people to being interviewed?
That's a great question. Because
I went to journalism school.
There you go. So yeah, good for you. So that's a great question, Janet, or one journalist to another, because a lot of times, it's really frustrating, right? Because even if someone gives you a lead or you have developed your own lead on a subject and a story, very often, you hit a wall right away, right? Like someone will say, the worst for me is when someone's a gatekeeper, right? So someone will say, and that was the case with Winston Morel, exactly, where I didn't have contact info for Win. I had contact info for not even his daughter, but a friend of his daughter's who I had run into at a talk. And then she put me in touch with his daughter, and his daughter felt like, I'm not sure it would be good to show people all these, things. I don't know whether people would think they're not of a lot of value. You know what I mean? She was being protective of her dad. And very often I just feel like if I can just talk directly with somebody, I know that I would never do. No one would have any idea where he lived. It's not like I'm ever going to, don't give anybody's address or a phone number. But I just felt like this man has created stuff that people ought to see. And I bet if I can talk to him, I can appeal to his sense of sharing it in a way that you'll otherwise never have the amount of people who might be as impressed as I am. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But in the case of Win, it did. And he and I became wonderful friends. The ship in the bottle that he made for me, he presented to me at a book talk that he came to years later in Beverly. So, but it doesn't always work, right? People have, sometimes you tear your hair out and somebody just won't budge and doesn't want to do the story. And that happens. But it's certainly wonderful when somebody sort of sees your point and sees that it might be worth sharing, and then they do.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody else have a question?
I think we've sort of come to the end.
That's okay too.
Any final words for us before we sign off?
The first word is a word of thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. As I said, I meant it. I don't know that I would. I mean, the furthest toward the Cape, I've spoken many times at various public libraries on the Cape, but I've never gotten over to speak, to the islands. So thank you. This was one way that it was possible to do it. And I thank you very much. I wish you continued great, I hope all public libraries get to reopen as soon as possible, and that you're doing book talks in person. And when you are, maybe I'll be able to virtually, if not in person. I'd love to talk with you once again when my next book.
I think your baseball book would be really popular in the fall. So to be continued.
All right. Thank you. And I didn't even say thank you enough to everybody who joined us tonight. Thank you all for joining us also. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Ted. Have a great night.
Thank you. You too. Be safe.